Catholics think the Eucharist is really Christ's body and blood. Where does the Bible say that? Why should I believe that? And then Catholics think we got to go out and prove all this, and we can, because I believe there's very good biblical evidence, which I'll get to here shortly, that I would focus you on to talk to him about. But also sometimes then we forget to say, well, wait a minute. Why do you believe the Eucharist is merely a symbol? Where does the Scripture say that the Eucharist is not Christ's body and blood, is he's not truly present, or that it is merely a memorial? The best that someone might come up, there's a few passages that might be brought up in that regard, and we cover those on our website. But sometimes even just asking that, the person hasn't really thought like, oh, that's not taught anywhere. They just have that assumption. This comes up with baptism a lot, that Catholics feel like we have to prove baptism is the means that we are regenerated, the means we become God's adopted children, and that's how we are saved. Whereas Protestants will say, well, baptism is just a way to show people you're Christian. And I would say, well, where in the world does the Bible say that? Because it doesn't. So back to the Eucharist then, ask him to say, what does he think the Eucharist is, and where does it teach that? And he may give you some verses, and you might want to go to our website at Catholic.com to respond to that. But I would recommend you do that. Number two, I pointed to some verses that I think show that the Eucharist is not merely a memorial, but that it is actually Christ, his glorified body and blood, his sacrifice in Calvary, represented under a bloodless, unbloody sacrifice. One would be, of course, John chapter 6, verses 53 through 57. And you could ask him when Jesus says, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life within you. You could ask him, what more would Jesus have to say? What would Jesus have to say to get you to believe in the Eucharist? And I would say it sounds pretty close to what he says in John chapter 6. The other one might be in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 28 through 29, when Paul says that those who receive the body and blood who receive the Eucharist unworthily are guilty of the body and blood of Christ. My mentor here, Tim Staples, makes this point, that if you say someone is guilty of somebody's body and blood, then if they receive the Eucharist unworthily, they haven't just desecrated a symbol. Once, I've used this example before, and I'm happy to use it again. If I tear up a picture of Cy Kellett, I'm not guilty of the body and blood of Cy Kellett. But if I tear Cy Kellett in half, I most certainly am guilty of the body and blood of Cy Kellett. So here, when Paul is talking in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, he's talking about how those who receive the Eucharist unworthily, they get sick and they die because they've desecrated that which truly is Jesus. So that might be where I would start. If I had even more time, I'd talk about the connection with the Lamb of Jesus being the Lamb of God and the Eucharist being the new Passover. But instead of explaining it, I'd rather send you my book, Why We're Catholic, which does explain it in chapter 14, and you could show that to your father-in-law and maybe have a discussion about it. But is that a helpful start?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny, the points that you pointed out, I did do that. I talked about in the Old Testament, you have to eat the lamb to, fulfill the Passover. You can't just remember the lamb. As kudos to the Jewish roots of the Eucharist, Petrie, Dr. Brant Petrie.
Yes, good book.
And listen to his talks too. And they just say, since he says, "Do this in remembrance of me," he wants you to remember. Therefore, it's a symbol. So,
yeah, and the brief reply to that, Nathan. So we'll send you our book, Why We're Catholic. Let's get your email here, and we'll send that to you. The brief reply to that is that the word "remember" there is not imploring us to remember what Jesus did, but it's the Greek word anamnesis, and what it means in that context is offer a memorial sacrifice on my behalf. See, when you read that, "do this in memory of me," it makes it seem like we're saying only that the apostles are to remember what Jesus did. But the larger, and that is a part of it, the Catechism references that. But the larger part is that using that word anamnesis, which is also used in a sacrificial context in other parts of the Bible, in the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, it refers to a memorial sacrifice, that you offer a sacrifice to God so that he, quote unquote, remembers what has been done on our behalf through Christ. So the asking, "do this in memory of me," is offer a memorial sacrifice on my behalf to the Father so that he may have mercy on you and forgive you. And I talk about that in depth also in my book, The Case for Catholicism. It's published by Ignatius Press. So I hope that's helpful, and I'm grateful you called in.